Welcome back. I'm now joined by the Chief India Economist at JP Morgan, Sajid Chinoy, the former Secretary General of FICCI, Rajiv Kumar, the Chairman of Infosys, R. Sheshasai, who because of the terrible weather in Chennai can only join us by telephone, and the editor of the Business Standard, A.K. Bhattacharya. Mr. Bhattacharya, let's start with the Q2 GDP figures released yesterday. After growing at 7% in Q1, the economy has grown at 7.4% in the second quarter. Does this suggest the economy is picking up, which is Arun Jaitley's interpretation, or because the average for the first half of the year is just 7.2%, does it mean we're only going to do marginally better than last year's overall growth figure of 7.3? Which of the two interpretations do you go with?
Well, I would go for the second interpretation. This is because the recovery is still very, very patchy. And as has always been seen, that the GDP numbers hide a lot of the real story in the investment figures. And if you look at the investment figures, which is the gross fiscal capital formation, there you don't see any sign of hope, in a sense that the gross fiscal capital formation has gone up very marginally from 39.8 to 30.1%. And the second point why I would like to make, and why I think the recovery is very, very patchy, is because if you take the valuables that have been added into the expenditure side of the GDP estimates, you realize that the growth rates have actually been further down to around 6.88, and which is only a 5 basis point increase over the previous quarter. So I don't think that the investments are a strong stimulus for this kind of growth. Number two, the GDP growth shows that the economy is still to get the benefit of higher investments, infrastructure stimulus. So on the whole, I am not very hopeful that the year will end with more than 7.5% growth.
Mr. Sheshasai, in the budget, the government forecasts growth between 8.1 and 8.4%. But the truth is, today, even to achieve 8%, the economy will have to grow at 8.9% for the next 6 months. And that, to be honest, is not just impossible, it's almost inconceivable. So if we only end the year at 7.5%, which is what Shaktikant Das said yesterday, how would you view that? As disappointing or reasonably good?
Well, firstly, I think the budget didn't quite factor in a poor monsoon. But having said this, somehow the buoyancy that we see in revenue belies the rather sluggish growth rates. So I guess between the swing and the roundabout, from a budget point of view, we may not have a major kind of a disappointment or a deficit in the top line. But if you look at the numbers that have come out now, I want to make one observation about the numbers. I think we have now a happy convergence between the gross value addition and the GDP numbers for the first time after a few quarters. So I guess that's adding on to the credibility of this number. Although I'm told that the taxation deflator that is used has been so widely fluctuating, that's a bit baffling. But nevertheless, I think on the whole, there seems to be greater credibility of the number that's coming. On the flip side, I think one interesting thing is...
Well, I'll stop you there. I'll come to the fisc in a moment's time. Let's stick for the moment to growth. Let's take it one by one so audiences can follow. So you're saying to me that even if we end up with 7.5% and miss the budget target of 8.1 to 8.4 by 0.5% or more, you wouldn't consider that too disappointing in the circumstances. Have I understood correctly?
Absolutely. I don't think it is disappointing, Karan. On the other hand, I think even if we say that the recovery is patchy, it's recovery nevertheless. And quite frankly, I'm pleasantly surprised about the 9+ numbers that you see on the manufacturing and the +2 numbers that you see on agriculture. But can I say that having said that, numerically, while this is pleasant surprise, this seems to run somewhat inconsistent to the anecdotal evidence that one sees in a number of from a number of situations.
Okay.
Principally on two things. One is the fact that the rural economy continues to be in distress. The nominal wage or the wage inflation is lower than the general inflation. Therefore, there's a real reduction in wage and therefore the purchasing power. Second is the anecdotal evidence of industries which are either facing the export market or are based on agro base are in distress.
Okay.
Whether it's leather or textiles or sugar, they're in distress. So from an anecdotal evidence point of view, I had expected to see much lesser performance. So therefore, numerically, that this is much better. So
Okay.
it's a bit baffling.
Mr. Rajiv Kumar, let's pick up on that one area that you heard. In fact, even Mr. Shasai said that was impressive, manufacturing. After growing in quarter one at just 7.2%, it's done remarkably well in quarter two. It's grown at 9.3%. How much cheer do you take from that, alongside the fact that other sectors, anecdotally, are not doing well at all?
Karan, about the manufacturing sector, it is a bit surprising to me because the index of industrial production has grown only by 4.7%, and today the numbers came out on the core sector's growth, which is 3.6%, which includes cement, coal, electricity, etc. Now, with those two numbers as they are, the growth of 9.3%, as Mr. Shishasai says, does surprise you very pleasantly and very strongly, but combined with the fact that the private investment is not growing, but that could well happen because, as the Governor, Reserve Bank said, there is excess capacity of up to 30% in the industry, so you could get growth without investment. That's true, and maybe that's the reason why you get 7.5% growth with only investment at only about 29-30%. So manufacturing, I am not clear, and also one must remember that exports have declined consistently for the last 11 months. But one factor I do want to point out right away to you, Karan, is that it is for the first time since I have ever tracked the GDP numbers that the GDP growth at constant prices is higher than the growth in nominal prices. This is a very important issue because that just means that our deflator, somewhere is negative, and negative quite significantly up to 2%. Now this is pointing to us in a direction which will say that there is some kind of a demand deflation or prices are just beginning to crash, and that could well be true of agriculture, the commodities, the minerals, and I am not sure as to how that will affect the budget numbers in terms of also the fiscal deficit, because the because that ratio will get very badly affected with this particular fact of nominal growth being lower than constant growth.
Let's take then the fiscal deficit, Sajid Chinoy, particularly in view of what you just heard from Rajiv Kumar. Most people say that even though the disinvestment proceeds this year are only 12,600 crores so far, which is just 18% of the 69,500 target the finance minister set himself, nonetheless, because of the huge reduction in oil prices, most people believe the government should meet its 3.9% fiscal target without having to compromise on investment in infrastructure. Now, because of what you heard from Mr. Rajiv Kumar, are you a bit more worried? Do you share his concern that the fiscal target could be under pressure?
Karan, I don't worry about this year's fiscal target, because what you've seen is, despite the fact that nominal GDP has been quite depressed, tax buoyancy has been quite strong, which is one of the indications the government will say is suggestive that there is a growth economic recovery in place. I'll digress, say we shouldn't get fixated about the actual numerical GDP number, because under the new series there is this disconnect between the numbers that print and the numbers that you experience on the ground and the ones that you have in the high frequency data. I think the focus is more on the rate of change, and what you've seen in the last 3 quarters, if you look at gross value add, which is the more reliable lateral part of GDP, is that growth has been accelerating from 6 to 7 to 7.5.
Okay.
So don't worry so much about the level or the magnitude, worry about the direction. That said, I think because taxes have been quite strong and the government's got this big oil windfall in the budget, not just through oil taxes, but because subsidies have collapsed, I don't worry about this year's fiscal target. In fact, public investment levels of this year's budget have been very high. Capital spending in that quarter that just passed by was growing at 40%. My worry is next year's fiscal, because then three things happen. One is you won't have incrementally more benefits from oil on the budget if oil prices were to stabilize. Number two, you've got a more ambitious fiscal target. You've got to reduce the deficit by 0.4% of GDP, which is 4 times as much as this year. And number three, you've got a big pay commission, which should push up the wage bill by 0.4 or 0.5%.
Absolutely.
So the worry really is next year, if you don't push up asset sales, something will have to give. And if you have to stick to your fiscal targets, the concern is public investment may have to be sacrificed, which won't be a good thing, because I'll end by saying all the fixed capital formation that you saw in the quarter 3, which was encouraging, was led by public investment.
Absolutely. I want to put that same question to you, Mr. Bhattacharya, and I'll add to all the elements that Sajid Chinoy mentioned that would have an impact on the fiscal deficit target of 3.5%, the 10,000 to 12,000 crore the government also has to spend on OROP. And some people say that the 7th pay commission could amount to additional expenditure of almost 0.65% of GDP. So are you seriously worried next year's 3.5 could be missed? Or if it's met, it will only be met because infrastructure spending will be squeezed, which will itself have an impact on growth?
I could agree with you more on this, the fiscal deficit forecast for the next year. I think next year I will add one more element to why fiscal deficit target of a lower extent will be more difficult to meet. And that is because the benefits that you enjoyed on the subsidies reduction, the incremental benefit will not be there, because you already have taken the gains on the subsidies front in the books, and therefore the additional gains will not be there unless you take those important steps in terms of disinvestment, the asset sales, and particularly in the case of the banking sector, the financial sector, if you don't take those steps and subsidy reforms are deepened, I think the fiscal deficit target will be a real difficult challenge next year.
Let's come to another element of concern, Mr. Shestasai, for many ordinary people, but also for the RBI, and that's inflation. It's crept back to 5.2%, but it's still well below the RBI governor's target for the year as a whole of 6%. Here, do you believe the situation is more sanguine and more in the control of the government? Or do you worry that this creep to 5.2 because of the pressure from food inflation could go higher still?
Well, at this point of time, I don't feel unduly worried. We know that the cost of inflation or the islands of inflation are somewhat restricted to the food products, pulses in particular the last quarter. It's not a pervasive inflationary situation. It's not a pervasive expectation of inflation, and therefore, to some extent, that gives you the confidence that, if so long as you can tackle some of these islands of problems, we can move along the lines and trajectory that the bank governor had suggested and worked on. And in a way, I would even argue that at this point of time, a bit of inflation is not a bad thing at all. And as Rajiv was pointing out, the fact that the actual growth rate, the nominal growth rate, is lower considerably. By the way, that's baffling to me. Why should this be so low as compared to the inflation-adjusted numbers? That is not a trend. That is a good trend if it persists.
All right.
And if it gets aggravated. So I think a little bit of inflation at this stage is not a bad thing.
Sajid Chinoy, given what we've discussed about growth, the fiscal deficit and the pressures it's under, now have we got Mr. Rajiv Kumar back? I can see him on screen. Yes, I believe we have. Let me go to you, Mr. Rajiv Kumar, while I have you, and then I'll go to Sajid. Given what we've discussed so far about growth, the pressures on the fiscal deficit, which you pointed out in particular, the beginning of some concern about inflation, What's your overall view of the economy's performance in 2015-16 so far? Mr. Kumar, Sajid, we don't have Mr. Kumar, forgive me. Let me put that question to you. What's your overall view of the economy's performance so far?
Karan, I think it has to be constructive, and I'll give you two quick reasons. The fact is every other emerging market in the world is struggling and is going to be extremely vulnerable to the fact that when the Fed raises rates, you could see large capital outflows, their currencies come under pressure, they're having to raise rates. India is in a very different situation. We're actually now seen as kind of a beacon of macroeconomic stability compared to 2 years ago. The fiscal deficit is down by almost 2% of GDP compared to 2 years ago. Inflation has halved. The current account deficit has gone from 5% of GDP to less than 1% of GDP. Now undoubtedly some of this is good luck because of lower oil and low commodities. But a lot of it is good policy, both fiscal and monetary. So I think the government and the RBI deserve enormous credit on the macro stability part. And yes, we can always talk about the fact that growth needs to pick up, it needs to be broad-based, private investment definitely needs to pick up. But the fact that GDP growth can accelerate in a year in which you've had a second successive drought, and the fact that exports have been terribly weak because global trade is contracting, says something about the underlying resilience of the economy. So I think sometimes we tend to be a bit too hard on ourselves. There's a long road ahead in terms of reforms. But I think we have turned a bit of a corner when it comes to growth, and on macro stability we're seen, at least around the world, as being an example to other emerging markets.
Mr. Bhattacharya, there's no doubt that if you look at the macro picture in terms of growth, in terms of fiscal deficit, in terms of inflation, even in terms of FDI coming in, the situation is significantly better than it was a year or two ago. But anecdotal evidence about how the economy is performing at the micro level, as well as the facts that are available, suggests a very different picture. And the biggest concern is, as you put it in your leader today in the Business Standard, investment activity is just not reviving. Why? What is putting off industrialists and investors?
Well, there are many, I will just cite a couple of factors why investments are not picking up. Investments tend to follow the infrastructure projects that should come in the way in the first place. And I don't think that the government has been able to get the infrastructure sector moving at a pace that it ought to have done. Both in the road sector, some activities have been seen, some projects have been cleared. You have seen the setting up of the locomotive factory in the railways, but these are early days. So unless the infrastructure sector gets moving, you don't expect the industry to put their money on the table. So which is why, while FDI is rising, if you look at the domestic investment, and if you look at the government's own estimates on the domestic investment, they are very, very small increases. So therefore, unless there is this investment push, which should be triggered by infrastructure bottlenecks to be cleared, I don't see that investment revival will be seen in near time. So therefore, the first thing is to clear up the infrastructural bottlenecks, and then you look at the overall investment revival as a job.
Now, Mr. Rajiv Kumar, not just this government, but if I recall correctly, the Manmohan Singh government for the last 2 years was trying very hard to clear up infrastructure bottlenecks. All sorts of procedures were put in place by Mr. Chidambaram, other procedures have been put in place by Mr. Jaitley, but those bottlenecks still seem to be holding up private sector investment. But something else now that's brought into the equation and is also holding up private sector investment is Raghuram Rajan's point that factories are running 30% below capacity. While that is the case, industrialists are not going to invest. They've got spare capacity of an enormous 30%. Is that because demand also isn't picking up in the economy?
Exactly, Karan. And I think while I agree with Sajid that we should pat ourselves on the back for achieving the macro stability, I think we should now turn our attention very strongly towards reviving growth and getting the growth impetus in the economy. Because if we want to continue with being credited by good policies, and I think we are here lagging behind the curve very badly. And there I think I should again point to the fact that if the consumer price inflation with a 46% weight of food prices is grossly overstating inflation, and the deflator is negative. So that should show to the policymaker that there is a huge demand deficiency in the economy, which is why there is this excess capacity in the industry. Now, how would that? If you look at cement prices, steel prices, you know, they're just collapsing. So, but other than the infrastructure, where I know that the government has put its attention to, I think that one sector which needs immediate and very focused policy attention is the real estate sector. I would like the government to announce a massive public housing program at this point of time, and which is where capital spending should be going. And I would not even bother as much, you know, with maintaining the fiscal discipline, because if we don't achieve that, and we may not achieve it even this year, despite the huge tax bonanza, because the budget assumed a nominal growth rate of about 10.5%, and they will get about 6.4%. But great if we achieve the fiscal deficit. If we have the fiscal space, please use it for reviving the real estate and the construction sector, because that has huge multiple backward linkages, and that will get the growth impetus into the economy.
Mr. Shesasai, you heard Rajiv Kumar talk about the real estate sector, and if I recall correctly, the real estate sector has grown very poorly in the last quarter. It hasn't done well at all compared to a year ago. Now, when the Prime Minister met investors and industrialists in September, he said the onus was now on them to be ready to take risks and invest. Do you agree with the Prime Minister that the onus is on Indian industry, or do you believe the onus is on the Prime Minister to create a climate where industrialists will want to invest?
Well, I think the Indian entrepreneur has always been fairly ahead of the curve in terms of the risk-taking capability, and in some measure I would say that perhaps in the last bubble years, some of the Indian entrepreneurs who took the risk in infrastructure are nursing the wounds now, which to some extent is also creating problems of further investments. It's a deterrent to further risk-taking, and therefore I think we have to contextualize this issue. But may I say that apart from the fact that the demand creation is clearly a policy issue, we need also to now bring into this narrative some discussion about the rural situation. I say this because there are three very important implications for the rural economy if the rural economy does not grow. One is, of course, the very apparent political connotation to that. If you can't get the 70% of the population in good shape, they're not going to give the right to do the reforms which will benefit the country as a whole.
Number two?
Which will benefit perhaps the urban sector even more than the rural sector, and therefore it's a precondition to get the rural economy moving, and that is in distress. And that's not entered the narrative. The central outlays have been much lower than the past, and that's something which needs to be looked at. The second is the social issue, the inequality that you begin to see between the urban and the rural sector, between the high income and the low income, will again become a major deterrent, and we cannot ignore those social issues.
And the third?
And the third is the fact that a very large part of the industry is today struggling because of the demand pull from the rural sector is not there. The agro-based industries, even industries like durables, like the two-wheelers and the tractors, they're in bad shape because of the rural economy. I think this has not it has not come to the center stage. In fact, I would say, let alone center stage, it has not got its due attention, and therefore it's about time that we say that yes, our narrative on economic development and growth must necessarily address this issue on the rural side.
All right, gentlemen, let's take a break at that point. Mr. Shesasai at great length has explained the consequences of not giving the rural economy the importance it deserves. And certainly, many people believe that this government hasn't focused anywhere near enough on agriculture or the rural economy. But there's another issue that I want to take up after the break. Has the government done enough in terms of reform to boost investment and to boost animal spirits, as Dr. Manmohan Singh used to call them? Or is that in fact a misreading, and has the government done a lot but not got credit? We'll be back in a moment's time to discuss that particular twin question.
It's the crucial climate summit in Paris, 2 weeks after a deadly terror attack. The focus is to save the environment. India has major initiatives, but in this, Prime Minister